Well, welcome to the debate. Imagine pulling up to the petrol pump in Wellington or Christchurch tomorrow morning and, seeing the price jump to $5 a litre overnight.
Yeah, that would be an absolute shock to the system.
It would. And imagine the global supply chains that our entire export economy relies on just grinding to an absolute halt.
Right.
Because that is not a hypothetical. That is the exact real-world scenario we are staring down by March 24th if the escalating standoff in the Middle East boils over.
And the catalyst for that scenario isn't just happening in a vacuum. We are watching two sides lock into this terrifying game of chicken.
Exactly. U.S. President Donald Trump has set a hard March 24 deadline with a really stark ultimatum.
Which is unprecedented in its bluntness.
Completely. He's saying Iran must fully open the Strait of Hormuz to international shipping, or the United States military will systematically obliterate their power plants, starting with the largest facilities in the capital, Tehran.
And of course, Iran has fired back. They're threatening to close the passage indefinitely and target civilian infrastructure across the Gulf in retaliation.
Right, which forces a very uncomfortable conversation for the rest of the world.
It really does.
Today we are asking a fundamental question. As international law breaks down into this vicious cycle of illegal reprisals, how should middle power nations like New Zealand respond?
Because we're right in the middle of this.
We are. New Zealand recently signed on to a 19-country defense statement, which is essentially a pledge to provide logistical and intelligence support to keep these vital shipping lanes open. I will be arguing that Iran's deliberate weaponization of chaos necessitates exactly this kind of firm, collective coalition response to protect the global rules-based order.
And I will be arguing that this crisis is fundamentally driven by superpower unilateralism and, frankly, illegal threats from the United States.
Okay.
In that context, joining any coalition, even a supposedly defensive one, is a dangerous trap. It will inevitably drag allied nations into an escalating, lawless ground war and result in just catastrophic civilian suffering.
Well, let's look at why we cannot afford to just lock our doors and hope the wind blows the other way. We are facing an immediate, tangible threat to international stability from a despotic Iranian regime that thrives in chaos.
Sure, the regime is problematic, but
they are actively violating the fundamental freedom of navigation right now. We are talking about state-sponsored piracy. They are capturing boats and targeting civilian oil tankers into literally one of the most vital waterways on Earth.
But we need to be accurate about what's actually driving the temperature up right now.
I mean, I am being accurate. Iran isn't just doing this directly either. They are using regional proxies.
Yes, they are.
Think of it like a mafia boss ordering hits through shell companies. You know exactly who was calling the shots and supplying the weapons to Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis in Yemen. But they use these proxies to maintain this plausible deniability.
Right, but the U.S. response is?
At some point, the international community has to step in. Signing on to the 19-country statement isn't a blank check endorsing Donald Trump's rhetoric. It is a legally and morally necessary stance. We simply cannot allow authoritarian actors to hold the global economy hostage by choking off international waterways.
The problem is that your framing treats the U.S. response as a standard police action.
I wouldn't say police action.
Well, what we are actually witnessing is a paper war where one illegal act simply justifies the next. Let's look at the mechanics of the American threat.
Okay, let's look at it.
Targeting civilian infrastructure like power plants, desalination plants, nuclear facilities without a clear, immediate military objective is a textbook war crime under international humanitarian law.
The threat is severe, yes.
It's beyond severe. It's catastrophic. If you take out a capital city's power grid, you aren't just turning off the lights. You are disabling the water pumping stations.
Right.
You are shutting down the sewage treatment plants. You are cutting the power to hospital ventilators. Millions of civilians will suffer immensely within days.
That is the reality of targeting a grid, yes.
And President Trump is acting as an unpredictable accelerant here. His objectives shift constantly. One day it's about nuclear enrichment, the next it's ballistic missiles, then regime change, and now it's the Strait of Hormuz. Joining a so-called defensive coalition under this umbrella is a complete illusion.
Let's pause right there, because I want to address the legality and this cycle of escalation directly. I will acknowledge right off the bat that attacking civilian power plants without a clear military objective violates the laws of armed conflict.
It absolutely does.
I am not defending that specific threat from the White House. but we have to look at the baseline Iran has already established. They are currently engaged in the indiscriminate use of ballistic missiles.
Which is horrific, I agree. But we need to—
Wait, let me explain the mechanics of what Iran is firing, because it really matters here. We are not talking about precision-guided munitions that can knock out a specific military radar.
No, they are massive.
Exactly. We are talking about missiles the size of London buses. They are inherently inaccurate. Furthermore, we are seeing the deployment of multiple re-entry vehicles.
Right, the MRVs.
Yeah. That means one massive missile goes up into the atmosphere and then splits into several different warheads that blanket a wide area. Firing those blindly towards civilian centers or international shipping lanes is already a war crime.
I'm not denying their actions are illegal.
So if you live in a quiet cul-de-sac and one neighbor starts systematically throwing lit matches into the letterboxes, you don't just stay inside. You step out, you form a neighborhood watch, and you stop the arsonist, even if the tactics to restrain him are messy.
See, that arsonist analogy falls completely flat when you look at the whole picture.
How so?
What if the guy leading your neighborhood watch is concurrently threatening to blow up the local water supply just to prove a point? You don't join him, you can't cure a disease with poison.
But you still have to put out the fire.
In international law, what we are talking about right now is a reprisal. That is the technical term for responding to an illegal act with another illegal act. It does not create order. It unravels the entire rules-based system you are claiming to protect.
But the Iranian position is completely different. They view the initial diplomatic and economic sanctions against them as illegal, which to them means all bets are off.
Right.
They feel justified in inflicting pain on civilians, capturing ships, and blocking the strait.
And the United States completely eroded the good faith required to de-escalate this long ago. They negotiated in bad faith on previous nuclear deals. They assassinated a top Iranian religious leader in a third country.
Those were definitely escalatory.
Exactly. When you remove all good faith, you are left with a lawless version of warfare. When Trump threatens to obliterate power plants, the inevitable physical ramification is that Iran will respond in kind. They will target the desalination plants that supply drinking water to the entire Gulf.
Two wrongs do not nullify the freedom of navigation, though. A civilian oil tanker, flagged to a neutral country and not carrying contraband, has an absolute legal right to transit that water.
On paper? Yes.
If the superpower dynamic is broken and trust is gone, I argue that actually makes it more critical for middle power countries like New Zealand to step up and provide a stabilizing layer.
But all this legal theory doesn't mean anything if we can't actually patrol the water safely. How does New Zealand actually contribute to a broken dynamic without getting our own people shot at?
Well, we don't have to be on the front lines to contribute.
You're talking about this 19-country statement as if it's a neat diplomatic shield. It is a direct pathway to military intervention.
Let's get into the practical realities of intervention then, because I need to push back on the idea that signing a piece of paper means Kiwi soldiers storming a beach in Iran.
It doesn't mean that on day one, sure.
There are entirely practical, non-escalatory ways for New Zealand to contribute. We can provide intelligence sharing. We have highly capable personnel analyzing satellite imagery and tracking drone movements from desks right here in Wellington.
Yes, we do.
And that's precisely like what we are doing for the Red Sea operations. We can deploy our logistics personnel to backfill allied bases in other regions, which frees up their dedicated assets to patrol the Gulf.
But you're still part of the war machine.
Defending a dual-use international waterway, a strait used for both commercial, trade, and military transit, is a fundamental obligation. We can be part of the defense of the water without firing a single shot.
I have to stop you there. That boundary between defensive intelligence and offensive warfare in a maritime choke point is entirely fictional.
Fictional? That's a bit strong.
Let's look at the actual geography of the Strait of Hormuz. We aren't talking about the open ocean. At its narrowest point, the strait is only 21 miles wide.
Right, it's a bottleneck.
And the shipping lanes themselves are only 2 miles wide in either direction. Defending those oil tankers isn't just about floating a frigate nearby and looking tough.
It is about providing a deterrent presence.
But the threat doesn't come from other boats in the water. It comes from the coastline. We are dealing with an asymmetrical adversary, meaning Iran isn't going to line up battleships against the U.S. Navy.
Obviously not.
They're going to use cheap, swarming drones and anti-ship missiles to blow up multi-million-dollar tankers. And here's the geographical reality. Modern anti-ship missiles don't need to be launched from a military base.
No, they're highly mobile.
Exactly. They can be fired from the back of a modified commercial truck, hidden in a cave 5 miles inland.
Which is exactly why aerial intelligence is so vital. You track the mobile launchers.
But tracking them isn't defending the strait. To actually secure that 21-mile gap, you have to neutralize the source of the attack. That means silencing those missile batteries, destroying the drone launch sites, and clearing sea mines under fire. Air superiority isn't enough when an adversary is deeply entrenched in mountainous coastal terrain.
I see your point.
To genuinely secure the waterway, you eventually have to pacify the coastal zones, and that inevitably requires boots on the ground.
I think you are jumping several steps ahead.
It's called mission creep, and it happens in every modern conflict. It's very easy for politicians in the beehive to say no boots on the ground on day one.
But we have maintained those limits before.
But as the mission expands, as the economic necessity to keep the strait open takes over, the realities of war set in. And we haven't even touched on the nuclear fallout of the U.S. strategy.
You mean the threat to the power plants?
Exactly. When Trump threatens a power plant, we aren't just talking about the lights going out. Some of these are dual-use facilities that house nuclear reactors for medical or research purposes.
Yes, they do.
They rely on the national grid for cooling systems. If you bomb the grid, containment fails. You bomb the facility directly, you suddenly have highly enriched nuclear material exposed to a chaotic war zone.
That is definitely a worst-case scenario.
Someone has to secure that stockpile so it isn't diverted to terrorist actors. So I have to ask you, walk me through how A doesn't inevitably lead to B. Is New Zealand truly prepared for the high likelihood that our defensive intelligence sharing morphs into an obligation to send the defense force onto hostile shores to secure loose nuclear material?
I acknowledge that the trajectory of conflict is always uncertain. Mission creep is a valid historical concern.
Very valid.
However, we have to weigh that risk against the absolute certainty of what happens if we do nothing. Let's look at the ultimate consequences, starting with the global economic fallout.
Okay.
As an export-driven island nation at the bottom of the world, we are uniquely vulnerable to the tyranny of distance.
We are, but joining a bombing campaign doesn't fix the supply chain.
Let me explain the mechanism of what happens if we appease this behavior and let Iran choke the strait. Roughly 20 to 30% of the world's total oil consumption passes through that 21-mile gap.
Huge volume, yeah.
If ships cannot safely transit, insurance premiums don't just go up, coverage is pulled entirely. Without insurance, oil contracts are voided. That oil is instantly removed from the open market.
Right.
Basic supply and demand takes over, and prices drive up exponentially overnight. We have seen these massive energy shocks before, in 1991, in 2003, in 2014, and in 2022.
And we felt them here.
Exactly. When global transport and energy costs spike, it cripples the New Zealand economy. It drives inflation, it bankrupts businesses, and it hurts working families. We cannot adopt an isolationist attitude while the global supply chain is hijacked.
I'm not suggesting isolationism, but joining a coalition that threatens Iranian infrastructure doesn't solve the supply chain issue. It guarantees its destruction.
I disagree. It provides deterrence.
If the U.S. and its allies start knocking out power grids and Iran retaliates by hitting Gulf oil infrastructure, which they have the ballistic missiles to do, you aren't just looking at a temporary spike in petrol prices. You are looking at a sustained energy crisis.
War always disrupts markets in the short term, though.
This wouldn't be short-term. Destroying the underlying infrastructure, the refineries, the desalination plants required to run them, the deepwater ports, that bakes the economic pain in for a generation. You are talking about years to rebuild.
But there is another mechanism at play here, which is the internal dynamics of Iran itself. We are dealing with a deeply repugnant regime that does not represent all of its citizens.
That is certainly true.
There are 91 million people in Iran, and a vast number of them desperately want freedom from theocratic oppression. By putting severe, collective external pressure on the regime, by stripping away their ability to project power and fund their proxies, we might actually empower the internal dissidents.
I don't know about that.
The economic squeeze could create the very fractures needed for the Iranian people to reclaim their own country.
That is an incredibly dangerous leap of logic. Breaking a regime open from the outside doesn't magically yield a neat democratic revolution.
It has happened in history.
Rarely. Neatly. Those 91 million people are not a monolith. You are dealing with profound ideological divides, deep ethnic complexities, and varying religious factions.
True.
If the central authority collapses under external military pressure, the most likely outcome isn't a liberal democracy. It is a massive, catastrophic civil war, much like we saw in Syria or Iraq.
So we just allow the regime to export violence because we're afraid of what happens if they fall?
We cannot use our distaste for a regime as a blank check for military intervention, and regarding those dissidents you mentioned, my deepest concern is actually for them.
Go on.
Right now, President Trump's rhetoric is actively encouraging dissidents to speak out, to take to the streets, and to rise up. But here is the grim reality of authoritarian survival. While the Iranian regime might not be able to shoot down American stealth bombers, they are more than capable of turning their heavily armed security apparatus inward.
They already do that.
Yes, but Trump is irresponsibly encouraging people to expose themselves to violent crackdowns without offering them any guarantee of safety or success. When cornered, authoritarian regimes lash out at their most vulnerable citizens.
That's a fair point about the vulnerability of the dissidents.
Iran thrives in chaos, as you pointed out earlier, but they use that chaos to justify tightening their theocratic grip. They want a sectarian conflict because it provides an external enemy. It forces the population to rally around the flag.
Look, I completely agree that Trump frequently underestimates his opponents, and that his chaotic approach to the international system undermines the very rules-based order we rely on. We are paying the price for that volatility right now.
We absolutely are.
But that brings me back to the core of why middle powers must act. If the superpower is acting erratically and the rogue state is acting illegally, the middle layer of the international community, the 19 countries on that statement, must form a bulwark.
A bulwark that's tied to the erratic superpower?
We have to draw a line in the sand and say you cannot block international waterways and you cannot fire ballistic missiles indiscriminately.
But you aren't drawing a line in the sand, you're stepping into quicksand. When New Zealand signs on to these statements, we legitimize the broader framework of the conflict.
We're just providing a defensive posture.
We can tell ourselves we are just analyzing satellite photos to protect cargo ships, sure. But we are actively aligning ourselves with a military apparatus that is concurrently threatening to commit war crimes by obliterating civilian power plants.
It's a difficult tightrope to walk, I'll admit.
You cannot neatly separate the defense of the waterway from the illegal war that preceded it. If we join this, we are enabling superpower unilateralism.
Well, let's summarize where we stand, because the friction between our perspectives highlights exactly why this is such a fraught issue for Wellington to navigate.
It's incredibly complex.
My position remains that despite the incredibly messy legal realities of the current U.S. administration's rhetoric, collective international action is essential. We are dealing with a despotic regime that leverages proxies, piracy, and indiscriminate ballistic missiles equipped with multiple re-entry vehicles to destroy the freedom of navigation.
Right.
For a maritime trading nation like New Zealand, sitting on the sidelines while authoritarian actors hold the global economy hostage is simply not an option. We can and must contribute to defensive coalitions, even through non-combat means like intelligence sharing, to protect the global rules-based order.
And my position is that the phrase defensive coalition is a dangerous misnomer when applied to a 21-mile-wide maritime choke point. Joining this conflict under the guise of waterway defense legitimizes a cycle of illegal reprisals and superpower unilateralism.
Okay.
Securing the Strait of Hormuz inherently requires neutralizing coastal threats and securing nuclear material, which inevitably risks entangling allied nations in an uncontrollable ground war. Furthermore, attempting to shatter the Iranian regime from the outside won't bring peace. It will trigger a catastrophic civil war among 91 million people and subject innocent dissidents to brutal crackdowns.
Despite our strong disagreements on the path forward, we have found crucial points of convergence today. We both clearly agree that the Iranian regime is deeply repugnant and oppresses its own people.
Absolutely. No debate there.
We also agree that the volatility and shifting objectives of the current U.S. administration make traditional alliances incredibly complicated right now. And crucially, we are in total agreement that the global economic pain stemming from disrupted oil supplies will be severe, and it is a pain everyday New Zealanders will feel acutely.
Spot on. The geopolitical maneuvering might happen in Washington and Tehran, but the economic shockwaves always hit home.
The consequences of either action or inaction here will be measured in years, not months.
It is a profound dilemma. Middle power nations are increasingly forced to choose between ignoring authoritarian chaos on one hand and participating in flawed, potentially illegal military coalitions on the other.
It's not a choice anyone wants to make.
It brings us back to that neighborhood on fire. When the arsonist is throwing matches and the neighborhood watch is threatening to blow the water mains, deciding exactly where to stand is the hardest choice of all. We encourage you to keep examining the complexities of international law, global security, and New Zealand's place in it. There are no easy answers, and the final judgment rests with you.